how do you typically model revenue?
There's three different components to what I'll call like a consumer brand with regards to revenue. To me, the financial model is the guiding light for all business decisions, and roadmap AI is going to be a massive impact on this industry. We're using AI to automate financial modeling and analysis effectively. I'm drawn to startups specifically just for the creation aspect of it.
In your view, what's the key to building a good e-commerce model?
I think the number one thing that you can basically mess up and the number one thing to focus on with these e-com businesses is if you mess up the forecast for your returning customer, it's the easiest way to mess up the gross profit forecast. I see the biggest mistake that I see a lot of the times is basically inflating a returning customer forecast, which then inflates the gross profit forecast, which then sort of throws off your unit economic targets.
Why would a tool need a platform in e-commerce versus just using a spreadsheet?
I would never use Google Sheets just because I know how to use Excel. But one of the things that people oftentimes get wrong is sort of like the retention decay curve in modeling for
Welcome to Financial Modeler's Corner, where we discuss the art and science of financial modeling with your host, Paul Barnhurst. Financial Modeler's Corner is sponsored by Financial Modeling Institute.
Welcome to Financial Modeler's Corner. I am your host, Paul Barnhurst. This podcast is where we talk all about the art and science of financial modeling with distinguished guests from around the globe. The Financial Modeler's Corner podcast is brought to you by the Financial Modeling Institute. FMI offers the most respected accreditations in financial modeling. I'm thrilled to welcome this week's guest to the show, Drew Fallon. Welcome to the show, Drew.
Thanks, Paul. Happy to be here.
We start every show with this question, because if you've modeled, you have a horror story, just the way it works. So tell me about that worst financial model you've ever seen or that you've worked with.
So when I know exactly. It's very clear in my mind. And
PTSD then.
Yeah, exactly. Ironically, it was for one of the most well-run businesses I've ever seen, the most profitable businesses I've ever seen, which sort of called into question whether or not I thought financial models even matter at this point, because I was like, if these guys don't know how to do it, then but of course they do. So it was literally, and I struggle to even call it a financial model, honestly, for a lot of reasons. There was no like driving schedules. There was no real inputs. There was like a sensitivity table that was literally just like hard coded, like all the way down. And they would literally say, if we do this much revenue and we spend, this much money, this is where our profit is. There was no balance sheet for it. And I was astounded by that, because I was like, this is, a really well-run company, 8-figure company. And to me, the financial model is the guiding light for all business decisions and roadmaps, right? So it was pretty incredible to see just like the lack of effort that was put into, the roadmap for the business, basically. But yeah, it was very poorly made.
It sounds that way. As I like to say sometimes, I think companies make money in spite of themselves, not because of themselves. You have to wonder.
Maybe,
sometimes.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes you're making so much money that you don't really need it that badly, I guess.
Wouldn't we like to be in that situation? Sign me up.
Yeah, right. I mean, if you're making that much, it's like, okay, well, until that stops, then who cares?
Yeah, like I was talking with the guy the other day, and just the difference between small and large company modeling. You rarely build a 3-statement model like Apple, right? They may do it for an M&A deal, but they're not doing it for the company. That's not how they build their plan. And we're talking about, I don't think they have to worry about their cash flow. They have at least 5-year runway, and the one guy's like, 5 years if they don't sell a single product for 5 years, right? And so it's just so different versus the small company where every little dollar matters, because you're like, I got a 12-month or 18-month runway.
Yeah, and a lot of times in our industry, it'll be paired with a 13-week cash flow model as kind of like a bottoms-up feedback into the balance sheet model, because e-com is it can be a tough business on working capital.
Yeah, no, I know it's definitely a heavy one on working capital. I did do a retail e-commerce model for a company a couple years ago and saw that challenge on their working capital.
Yeah, it's not fun.
Oh, I can imagine. So tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, what you're doing today. So give us the rundown on Drew.
Yeah, so I've been mostly within like the e-commerce and CPG industry for the better part of the last 10 years now, coming up on. I started getting into e-com sort of in what I call the glory days of Facebook and drop shipping, right? So 10 years ago, pretty much anybody could stick $1 into Facebook and get a couple bucks out. That has, since changed. But so when I was 18, I started my first brand. And I went to college with the two founders of a brand that was called Mad Rabbit. And so Mad Rabbit was started while we were in college. It took off pretty quickly. And so we graduated in 2019, the three of us. We went on to our full-time jobs. So I went on to do equity research on an e-commerce desk where we were doing a lot of the IPOs during like the 2020, 2021 boom. So
Was that a lot of SPACs, IPOs?
I was on like
time.
It was a huge SPAC time, but I was on more of like a mega cap desk. So like we did like the Airbnb IPO, for instance. Yeah, those weren't going out in SPACs, but so like we did the IPO for like Corsair, which sells like hardware, like monitors and computers. We did Airbnb, we did Vroom, which sells cars online. And so I familiarized myself sort of the equity capital market specifically during that 2 years or whatever it was. And in the meantime, Mad Rabbit had grown to about 3 million in sales. So it was still a very, very small business. But at that point, we decided to go full time on it. And so I was the founding CFO of that brand for about 5 years. We were a Series A backed company. When we started, it was a one product Shopify store. And by the time I left last summer, it was a, 24 product omni-channel, 8-figure business. We launched Walmart last year. We launched Amazon, a couple of years prior. And so saw a lot, through the evolution of a brand from really, 0 past 10 kind of a deal. And one of the things that I realized and I learned was that the financial talent within this industry specifically, within this e-commerce and CPG industry specifically, doesn't really exist, honestly. And so like, when I quit my job on Wall Street, I took a significant pay cut, and I did it because I wanted to be part of a startup, right? And I was kind of part of the beginning of it. But that's not a realistic expectation. And so when e-commerce in 2022 was the 2022 was the first year that e-commerce did not grow as a percentage of retail year over year. And when that happens, all the margin starts to get sucked out when the growth is gone. And so people in our industry all of a sudden turn their attention very voraciously towards financials, operations, unit economics, et cetera. And so I say all this because I'm leading up to what I'm doing now, which is where I'm the co-founder and CEO of an e-commerce specific FP&A tool called Iris, where we're using AI to automate financial modeling and analysis effectively.
Great. Yeah, I knew where you were going on that. You and I have talked about Iris, and we'll get to that a little later and give our audience an opportunity to learn a little bit more about that. But before we jump into that, what interests you in e-commerce? Obviously, you did it right out of high school. I think you mentioned your first one. You joined Mad Rabbit. You've done a lot of e-commerce. Why that industry? Like, what attracts you to e-commerce?
So I always thought e-commerce specifically, there's two things. Like number one, the barrier to entry was extremely low, right? So like for, an 18-year-old kid who wants to start a business, it's kind of like the natural choice. I wasn't like an engineer, so I couldn't go and code my own
Sure.
software startup or whatever. But more importantly, I fell in love, honestly, with like the marriage of like art and science between like branding and like e-com specific like paid media. So like you have, like the Warby Parkers and the Allbirds and like all these like beautifully done brands, right? That really are just selling shoes on the internet or whatever. But it's all about like design, right? And like they're able to capture market share because they can, take advantage of this new distribution channel. But more importantly, because like it's a brand that people actually resonate with, and you owned your audience, and you were marketing to an audience that you owned direct, like you were selling direct to the consumer. And I thought that like Red Antler, which is like this really famous branding agency, did such a great job with so many of these brands, and I wanted to make one because I thought they looked cool. And then on the flip side of the more sciencey part was that like running Facebook ads and doing paid media is a lot like day trading. It's not like brand marketing. There's no mood boards and stuff. It's very like head in the computer, optimizing campaigns, multiple hours per day. Like it's very, very high intensity, very engaging type stuff. And so I liked the sort of marriage between like, hey, you take the sort of creative aspect and then you take like the sort of quantitative aspect and you marry the two together, and that's how you scale a successful D2C brand.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. I appreciate that answer. And I was going to say definitely a little bit art, a little bit of science. When you say brands, like one that comes to mind that I love is, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Cotopaxi,
Of course, yeah, yeah.
right? I know the CEO. I know the
Oh, cool.
CFO. I've interviewed the CFO. I know the company well. And I love the message. He chose the company because he thought he could do the most good with an outdoor brand. And then he built the business around his idea of how capitalism should work. And so it's totally, there's so much art in that. They build a loyal following on the brand. It doesn't matter that it's
Yeah.
outdoor gear. That works really well for their message, and it was the right product, but it wasn't about outdoor gear. That's what I find fascinating with some of these businesses on that art side of e-commerce.
Yeah, because like, before sort of D2C or e-com, you couldn't market a brand identity to your customer list. Like you kind of just hope that you stood out on the shelf at Target, and like if you turned over, then like you got velocity. But if not, then there wasn't much brand before the internet really kind of took over.
Yeah, shelf space in retail is really hard to stand out with just shelf space. You either have to have your own store or be selling it in some way that you can connect with that end customer. Otherwise, how do you stand out?
Correct. And a lot of these retail buyers will be looking for brands that can drive foot traffic. Like we'll put you on our shelf if you can bring customers in. So like I think Mad Rabbit, when we got into Walmart, we already had like 1 million followers on social or whatever. And so that was a big part of the pitch, right? Because we were like, we can drive traffic to your stores.
Yeah, I could imagine. I was just in Canada a couple weeks ago. We did training with Walmart.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, speaking of them and a little bit of the, kind of their reputation and different things of the challenge of getting in with them being such a big retailer.
Yeah.
So I'm sure that had to be a huge moment for you guys.
It was, yeah.
So the next question, this is your third startup. Why startups? What is you love about them? Obviously you like e-commerce, but what is your thing about startups? Do you just like pain or?
That may be the answer, Paul, because when I left Mad Rabbit, the brand was doing really well. We had just launched Walmart. We raised $10 million in Series A. And I think I just like pain because I went through all the pain part of Mad Rabbit, and then the brand finally is like, it's on its like real legs. We kind of like made it in some ways. Not that like it was a, massive $1 billion company or anything like that, but it was, we did, what we were, mostly setting out to do. I think I'm drawn to startups specifically just for like literally like the creation aspect of it. Like I'm somewhat addicted going like 0 to 1. Like there's nothing that motivates me personally more than like being able to wake up on any given day, and like that day you can actually make a difference within the business. Like Iris, extremely early stage business. If I go out there and I hustle today, I can literally, add 5% to the business or whatever, you know what I mean? Or if I go and I make a great hire, or I go and I try to find somebody, that's going to be a real needle mover. And eventually you kind of, you run out of that, and your role changes, right? But I do think it is kind of like an addictive motion, and it's a little bit of like a calling, which sounds like kind of cliche, but I loved my banking job. I really did, but I didn't love being in like the corporate environment.
You love that startup and making the difference and building something. It's those early days that get you excited. And there are a lot of people like that, serial entrepreneurs.
Yeah.
They always want to be starting that next company because they love the building. And then as soon as it gets to a certain size, they're like, I'm out. No longer interests me. I'll go find my next project, so to speak.
Yeah, this one might be a little bit different for me because Iris really does sit at sort of I could do this stuff for the rest of my life. I really do love as so this is probably the right place to say it, but I really do love like building out models and like performing analysis and all that stuff. Like I could do all this stuff all day, and the technologies that we're using to do some of this stuff are really, it's really incredible. I think AI is going to be a massive impact on this industry.
Yeah, if you say you love modeling, you're on the right show.
I was going to say like that would make me normally sound like a nerd, but I think this is good for it.
This is the nerd podcast. I have 3 podcasts, and they're all nerd podcasts. I only invite nerds to the show, so you're all good. You're in good company. Why don't you give us maybe just a 1-2 minute overview? What is Iris for those who are listening? We'll get into it a little bit more, but give us a quick overview of what Iris does.
Yeah, so Iris, like I said, sort of like a 4th generation FP&A tool in the sense that we integrate with all of your existing data sources that would originate any transaction, right? So let's think about a brand like Mad Rabbit, right? Because that's a good example of an e-commerce brand. Selling on Shopify, selling on Amazon, selling into Walmart via SPS Commerce, which is a cloud-based EDI system. Advertising on Facebook, advertising on Google, payroll is on Gusto or whatever. That's all internet-based. And so these digitally native brands, theoretically, you can understand the financial performance in real time of these businesses if you can orchestrate and centralize all of that data, right? Because it does exist on the internet.
Yeah.
So we connect into all of your revenue and expense lines, right? Anything that would fall into like a ledger, like a QuickBooks or NetSuite ledger. We create a data warehouse for you where you have a P&L, effectively financial data in real time, right? So you can understand on Tuesdays, my contribution margin or my sales are 10% higher than they are on Wednesdays. Because in e-commerce, that matters. Like we literally have daily marketing calendars, right? Because like I said, it's very high velocity. Like you're in the ads manager. Today could be 50 grand, tomorrow could be 100. And so we centralize and structure all of that data. And then we train the ML and the AI on a structured data set. We have a couple billion in GMV at this point. And so we use that to basically help them create better financial forecasts, right? So if you're a winter apparel brand, you sell winter coats, and you think that your CAC is going to go down in the summertime, Iris can be like, hey, that's not likely, right? Based on our category data, right? Because we've structured everything sort of apples to apples. So we basically run the ML to help people with the inputs of their model, right? So if you have a CAC driver in your model, we can help you sort of define the parameters around, hey, really based on your historical data and category, tailwinds, headwinds, we think that this driver should really sit here. And so we automate the construction and facilitate the forecasting of the actual financial models themselves based off of all of that structured data that we're also performing analysis on.
Makes sense. So let's get into the meat of this, financial models for e-commerce. In your view, what's the key to building a good e-commerce model? What are some of those things that are most important to get right?
So I think the number one thing that you can basically mess up and the number one thing to focus on with these e-com businesses is the returning revenue number. So there's a couple things here, but number one, Amazon has always been a traditionally, opaque API, or they don't share much data, right? Until recently. And so now you can understand new and returning customer analytics from Amazon. You have to have a certain, tool like Iris to actually do that, to see cohort analytics. But basically, if you mess up the forecast for your returning customer, it's the easiest way to mess up the gross profit forecast, right? And if you mess up the gross profit forecast is what dictates how much money you should be willing to spend on a CAC, right? Because because there is no CAC the second purchase, right? And so if I think I'm going to get $2 out of my returning customers in gross profit, I only get $1, but my CAC is $1. Now I'm burning into the red, right? And I'm losing money not because my CAC, is too high, but because my returning customers is too low. And so, one of the things that people oftentimes get wrong is sort of the retention decay curve in modeling for returning customer revenue. Founders are generally pretty optimistic, and they like to look at their subscriber retention as opposed to their overall customer base. And it's well, you're only 20% of your customers are subscribers, right? Not everybody's buying your coffee every single week. And so I see the biggest mistake that I see a lot of the times is basically inflating a returning customer forecast, which then inflates the gross profit forecast, which then sort of throws off your unit economic targets.
That makes a lot of sense what you were saying there about customer retention, right? You get that wrong, you get that curve wrong, and it just throws off all your unit economics, your gross profit. It changes everything, especially like you said, hey, well, we got really good subscribers returning. Well, yeah, but subscribers are generally a small part of your overall business unless you're some kind of only subscription in your e-commerce, which most aren't. There are some, but that's generally not how you see e-commerce. It makes a lot of sense. So speaking of that, how do you typically model revenue? How do you think about it? Is it mostly by those different cohorts you talk about? Or if you're building a financial model for e-commerce, walk through the revenue piece a little bit for us.
Yeah, so it's actually a pretty hot topic right now in the industry. I'm seeing a lot of people sort of turn to this idea of cohort forecasting, which I didn't know wasn't wasn't popular, honestly. But so basically, there's 3 different components to what I'll call like a consumer brand with regards to revenue. You have like your Shopify revenue, right? And under that, you have new customers that go to Shopify and returning customers that go to Shopify. You have Amazon revenue, which is new and returning as well, as long as you have a tool to help you understand that. And then you have the wholesale component, right? And so with the new customer revenue, we model it off of a CAC, right, and off of a new customer AOV. So if I'm going to spend, $50 in marketing next month and my CAC is going to be $25, I'm going to get 2 customers. If they each spend $50, that means that my revenue is going to be $100, right? And so those 2 customers that make up my $100 in new customer revenue, those are now my, that's my cohort for July, call it. Yeah. And then you do like a retention curve, based off of historical and seasonal data and whatever sort of adjustments you think are appropriate. And then that's how you come up with like the returning customer number. And then there's a returning customer AOV as well, because in our industry, in general, people spend more the first time. So I might go to cotopaxi.com and buy 4 or 5 items and then decide that I really like the shorts more than I like the hoodie or, whatever it is. And I want another pair of shorts. And then I come back and I buy 1 pair of shorts. And so you have to account for sort of that downtick in a returning customer AOV. And then, all of that gets rolled up into the actual LTV itself. And so effectively what you're doing is modeling LTV, right? Because you're modeling the first purchase and then you're modeling the subsequent purchases. And so you're modeling all in a lifetime value. And then you do that for Shopify, you do that for Amazon. And then, we don't have to get into the weeds on the wholesale or retail component, but it's usually a consumption-based model around like units per store per week, where, you say I have 5 SKUs in Target and they want me to sell 2 units per store per week in 2,000 stores or whatever. And so that's generally how we're doing revenue forecasting.
So it sounds like that cohort, being able to break it out, group it, is really critical to getting your revenue forecast right, because it has a huge impact on how you model your expenses.
Yeah, so I think, worth noting, there's this idea, and it's a little bit less popular now than it used to be, kind of when, we were all trying to grow a little bit more than we used to, or maybe than we are now. People were very oftentimes trying to break even on customer acquisition, right? So if my, AOV for new customers is $50 and my cost of goods sold is half of that, so $25, I'm willing to spend $25 on CAC, have a 0% contribution margin ratio, because I know that those returning customers are going to lift my contribution margin into the green. So that was a good way to that was actually a fine way to scale a business, right? Because you're not losing too much money. You're, acquiring customers about as aggressively as you can.
Yep.
Without literally losing money every time you spend a dollar on Facebook or whatever. And so if you lose hold of that returning customer cohort that's supposed to push you into the green and cover some of the OpEx, you will start slowly dying, right? Like you'll just start to, your burn or your income will be negative, and you'll have to get onto some sort of like equity or debt, treadmill that, like, by the way, those are pretty much dry these days for e-commerce. And so, yeah, that's pretty much it's the number one thing that people mess up that I see.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds in a lot of ways. Obviously, it's different, but like SaaS subscription, right? That churn rate has such a huge impact on that lifetime value of that customer. Helps you determine how much can I spend to acquire the customer. And if I get that churn rate wrong, or I get the average order value wrong, it makes a huge difference on how much I can spend. If you overspend on acquisition, you're going to die at some point, right?
Yeah. Because you're saying like, okay, like my model, right, is going to spit out LTV to CAC of 3.0, but if it's only 1.5 on the first, purchase, then it's 2.0, like, that's where, like, the 3.0 LTV to CAC is where the hockey stick kind of, happens. So if you can't achieve that escape velocity with those unit economics, you should probably stop scaling, honestly,
Yeah, you're gonna die at some point if you can't make the economics make sense. So stop scaling and wasting money till you figure that part out. Either find a way to lower your CAC, increase the order value, whatever it might be, but there's ratios that have to make sense for long-term growth and long-term sustainability.
Yeah, and there's one thing that people, the defense to that would be, I'm going to scale these poor unit economics as much as I can until I can get into a retail partner. So like because, back in the day, and I've written pretty extensively about this, the idea that like, D2C used to be margin accretive compared to retail, right? Because we were cutting out the middleman and we can pass out our costs and we don't have to pay Target or Walmart for this stuff. Now, on like a contribution margin basis, retail is actually accretive, right? And so you could, I've had conversations, I'm not advocating for this necessarily, but if you build a model and you say, hey, like I am willing to scale this, 2.0 LTV to CAC to 20 million, because that's when I know that Target's going to pick me up, then I can basically model out revenue in Target that has like a better contribution margin. And then at some point, those lines will cross. And it was all worth it in the end, kind of a thing.
No, I get it. If you have a plan to where you could change those economics at some point, whether it's the volume or whatever, I get it. You're willing to spend it. It's like when money was free, just get growth at any cost. And then as money became more expensive, now it's like, oh yeah, we probably should balance the cost side of this versus growth. It's interesting how we go through those cycles and we keep learning the fundamental lessons that at some point, growth is not the priority. Doesn't matter when, just at some point, it has to make sense. FP&A guy here. And as you know, I am very passionate about financial modeling and the Financial Modeling Institute's mission. I have been a huge fan of the FMI for years, and I was super excited when they decided to sponsor the Financial Modelers Corner. I recently completed the Advanced Financial Modeler certification and loved the entire experience. It was top-notch from start to finish. I am a better modeler today for having completed the certification. I strongly believe every modeler needs to demonstrate they are a qualified financial modeler, and one of the best ways to do that is through the FMI's program. Earning the accreditation will demonstrate to your current and future employers that you are serious about financial modeling. What are you waiting for? Visit www.fminstitute.com/podcast and use code podcast to save 15% when you enroll in an accreditation today.
This is the first time that's ever happened to e-commerce. E-commerce that like wasn't a thing it wasn't a thing.
Good point.
Yeah. So this is like people, the participants in this industry they can't fathom that idea. Like they don't know what's going on. They just know that their friends are dying left and right. Because as long as e-commerce has been in existence, it's always grown until 2022.
Yeah, it's been a fast growing industry. It's mostly had low capital during those 20 years, very cheap money.
Yep.
And it's like, yeah, why not just keep spending? We'll figure it out. We just need to get into this retailer or do this or turn this corner. And it becomes very easy to always think, I will take care of itself later. Just get the revenue.
Exactly.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And it can be a dangerous game. Sooner or later, somebody's going to get burned. You just hope not to be one of those companies. That you got your hockey stick before the change. All right, so I have a question for you. Just what are the kind of the key assumptions, operational metrics beyond the revenue stuff we've talked about, wanting to look at CAC and LTV and all those things that you should be looking at when building an e-commerce model? What are some of those other key assumptions and operational metrics?
So one of the biggest ones, I think, in terms of like driving costs and also driving insight is whatever sort of like drivers you're using for the fulfillment costs, right? So when we think about shipping these, I'm gonna sell you, this water bottle. It's not that light. It probably weighs 1.5 pounds. And if I sell it to you for $20, it may cost me $15 to ship it to you. And so having a good data model around how am I actually going to forecast these fulfillment costs, right? Whether it's postage, pick and pack, other 3PL fees. You need to have a pretty sound data model in terms of like predicting, okay, like if I send out this many products that weigh this much to these zones, right? Because if I ship to California, it's going to be a lot different price than if I ship to New York if I'm in California. And so it becomes this like pretty multifaceted, multivariable equation where you have to understand your product mix, right? So that's another one, right? So now you have to understand product mix, because if I am a men's grooming brand and I sell a beard shaver, and then I also sell fragrances, the beard shaver weighs 3 times as much as the fragrance does, and it's way more popular with people in New York, And so I spend way more money shipping, the shavers than I do the fragrances. And so if my expected product mix is going to change, let's say in Q4, Black Friday, Cyber Monday, I sell way more face shavers than I do in any other season. Well, then my cost per shipment is going to go up as well. And so I'm taking gross margin hits on shipping and on product costs. You got to be ready for that stuff because again, that's the gross profit that dictates the CAC. And so if you get the gross profit wrong, then you get the CAC wrong, and then all of a sudden you're losing money and you die. And so I think on the sort of expenses side, because these businesses have very low OpEx, right? I mean, you're spending maybe 10% of revenue on like personnel, 15, 20 if you're overstaffed probably, just because the operating leverage is so low. And so I would say a lot of that attention on sort of the cost side is concentrated in the cost of goods. And there are a few moving pieces, including product costs and shipping costs, basically.
Makes a lot of sense. So it sounds like the big thing I'm hearing there on the expense side is really understanding your product fulfillment, how your mix, how your different assumptions impacts that, and being prepared for that.
Yeah, because for Mad Rabbit, it actually costs us more to ship our products than to make them.
Yeah, I could believe it. Yeah, I mean, and so that shipping cost, obviously your COGS are important, but that's usually pretty stable. Shipping, obviously, depending on your product mix, could change pretty materially depending on what type of products you offer. Think of Amazon. I'm sure someone who's ordering a couch versus somebody who's ordering some groceries, right? There's a very big difference in shipping there and that mix, and they're covering all that under Prime. So I'm sure there's a whole team running all those numbers and scenarios to understand how they'll impact gross profit.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, on that note, like with Shopify and Amazon, so, Shopify gross margins, including shipping, right, are generally going to be anywhere from 20 to 40% higher than what's on Amazon. Because like you have, Amazon's going to take 35 cents off the dollar every time. And so you can hit a revenue goal, right? Like let's say my revenue goal is $2 million and I want to do $1 million in Shopify and $1 million in Amazon. And my marketing budget for that is $500K. And so I want to make, 200 grand or whatever the contribution is. You hit that $2 million spending $500K on ads, but Amazon is 1.5 million versus 1 million. All of a sudden, you're going to see gross margin compression from the channel mix, which is going to cause you to miss your or your contribution margin target, despite the fact that you hit your sales goal and your advertising budget, right? So that's the sort of devil's in the details type, part of the P&L that I certainly have missed in the past as well.
Sure, right? You could have been 20% better on your revenue and still been worse on the bottom, depending on that mix shift.
100%, yeah. It's like it's nuts, like.
No, and I've seen some of that in different businesses as well, where we had a mix of subscription and transactional, and it was a business where we sent out a ton of mail, 50, 60 million pieces of mail a month. If we had a lot higher mail, but had some big miss on subscription, we could beat on revenue, but get hammered on the bottom line.
Yeah.
Because the cost of goods sold, postage, paper, printing, all that is huge for mail.
Right. And that's why it's not enough. There's a lot of people who only model the revenue, and it's not enough.
I would 100% agree with that. I learned a ton about all our different programs and how much mail went out to try to really start to understand our business. And so not e-commerce, but similar type principles of having to understand mix and your cost and all those type of things. So that's what I think of when you mention that.
I was just gonna say, I spent the last couple of days building a model for my new company and it's software, and it's a lot easier.
You're like, this I can handle. I don't have this returning customer thing. It's how long does the customer stay? And I know what the monthly revenue is.
Yeah, exactly. It's really, and it's, the costs are almost all fixed. Like it's pretty simple.
It was pretty nice to model that way versus when you had to do it before, in the sense of easier, maybe not as challenging intellectually.
Yeah, I would say, because I actually built it in almost the same way with the revenue model. The only difference with software is that there's going to be like an expansion type schedule in a lot of cases, right? And you probably honestly know more about modeling software than I do. This is the first time I've ever done it. But the sort of cost schedules are like, it's just like staff. And then it's like, until your revenue is larger than that number, like the difference is the burn. And, that it actually, modeling software has made it very clear to me why venture capital is actually a very fitting tool for this business model. It's actually been a pretty eye-opening experience.
I could imagine. Well, good. I'm glad to hear it. I'm glad you got that opportunity to do something a little different and just see that inside to that window. Because yeah, it's definitely different. So let's get back a little bit to Iris Finance. We've talked about those e-commerce models. Why would a tool need a platform in e-commerce versus just using a spreadsheet? Like why Iris or any of the others out there? I know there are others in the industry as well, but why would they want to have a modeling tool?
Yeah, so it kind of goes back to my my earlier point, which is like there isn't much financial talent in these businesses. And I see a lot of it getting done in like Google Sheets. The problem with that is that like if anybody who like knows how to like use Excel like doesn't use Google Sheets. Do you agree with that?
Not 100%. Most of the time, I'll agree with that. I know a few.
Like I would never use Google Sheets just because I know how to use Excel. And so like these people, they end up using these Google Sheets in just like the worst ways. Like they need to be told what to do. They really do. Like, even like there's several $100 million brands on Iris that don't have CFOs. They don't even have like finance teams. Like they literally, just have their Google sheet and they try to forecast it, and there's no like method to the madness. And so again, Iris takes this vertical approach because our model is templated in the exact way that you and I have just spent the last 15 minutes discussing. And so you basically plug and play Iris, you just connect into all of your integration sources, and you have a financial model a day later with like, all the schedules that we've spent all this time talking about. And so number one, they don't know how to do it, generally speaking. Number two, they aren't necessarily familiar with all the moving components, right? So like that channel mix that we talked about, like part of what Iris does on the analytics side is a lot on the cost stuff, right? And so you cannot miss, that Amazon fees forecast if you have the Amazon revenue forecast in Iris. Like it's unbreakable in some ways. And so, and then third is just sort of what I talked about a little bit earlier, which is like just the sort of the guidance of the inputs, right? So because we have access to significant amount of categorical data, we're able to help people understand like what's a reasonable expectation, right? 99% of brands on Shopify are below $10 million in sales. And so like it's very high volatility. It's hard to know good inputs for a 2-year-old brand that's done $9 million in its life, And so if they can get any sort of direction based off of like what we've seen, it actually is pretty valuable. And the other thing is like, we have the financial model within Iris. We have a cash flow model and a strategic, 3-statement model. Those are 2 of like 7 features that we have. So we have like a metrics library. We have like a real-time plan to actual. We have a host of other sort of what I'll call like BI tools. And so it kind of marries the 2 in one place, which I think is advantageous as well.
Makes a lot of sense. Appreciate giving a little more detail there. And kind of when you mentioned nobody chooses Google over Excel, I would have almost agreed with you. But just last week, I interviewed someone who's an Excel MVP, and he gave all the times he uses Google Sheets over Excel and why Google Sheets is better. Data entry. He says for data entry, it's a better tool. He goes, if I need Power Query, I'm going to use Excel. It works better for importing ranges, using queries in his mind in some areas, and there's other things he really likes about it. It has a number of functions that Excel does not have. He's done an analysis of every single function between the 2.
Okay, well, he probably knows better than I do then.
So yeah, he's probably the foremost expert of the 2 tools. So it's a really interesting discussion because most people say, hey, collaboration is the only situation you should use Google Sheets. And he's like, I 100% disagree with that. And here's why. So it was an interesting discussion. Before this interview, it was just last week, I probably would have agreed with you. That's why I was like,
okay. Yeah.
Really good point. It'll come out in a few weeks. I recommend listening to it. It made a lot of good points between the 2.
Definitely.
But as for me, I use Excel 99% of the time. So I'm with you.
Yeah. I
get it.
Yeah, it's like a stuck in my ways thing or something. I don't know, but like, I also just don't know the Google Sheets shortcuts, admittedly. So like, I can't leverage it in the same way.
Yeah, that's another challenge. A friend of mine because this company only uses Google Sheet, is there's a add-in called SheetWhiz where you get all the major Excel shortcuts in Google Sheets, like $50 a year for it or something. And he's like, since I can't use Excel at this company, I'm going to do that. He's starting to become a big fan of Google Sheets. I think he still prefers Excel, but with that, with their import range and some other things, he's like, I'm actually starting to like it. It has some real advantages. It was kind of funny. Like, okay.
Yeah. It's $50 a year. That's a pretty good deal.
Yeah. I mean, right. Especially for a company. If you're working for a big company, they're going to not bat an eye at $50.
Yeah.
If it makes you more productive.
You can trace precedence independence. That's a big one.
Yeah. I can see you probably pulled it up there and looked at it for a second.
I did pull it up. Yeah. There's only like 10 though. There's not like that many.
Yeah. I haven't looked at it at all. I just know he said that helped him.
Yeah. It's a great idea.
Speaking of shortcuts, what's your favorite Excel shortcut?
So one of the, like I'm a formatting geek. So I think honestly like half of a good spreadsheet is the formatting and presentation of it. And so I love all of the formatting shortcuts, like the borders, Alt HBP, HBO, HHN, or whatever, the HHF, HFC, like basically all the colors I love. And I love
everything on the home menu.
Yeah.
Alt H.
Yeah.
That's your friend.
Yeah, Alt H. Like that's where I live. Like I think you can really change credibility wise. You can really make people think that this is a better model just because it's formatted more beautifully. So I live in there, honestly. I think Alt ASS is probably the funniest one, but it's also pretty useful in a lot of contexts as well for just like sorting things.
Oh yeah, so it took me a second. I'm like, Alt, that's data. Oh, S is sort, and then sorting.
Yeah. So if you wanted to like sort a range alphabetically or whatever, you type in ASS into your computer and.
Yep, there you go. I'll never think of it the same now. I hadn't quite put it together that way. Thanks a lot. No, I'm just kidding. All right. We're going to move on to our rapid fire section. So I'm going to lay the ground rules of how this works. You get no more than 10 seconds to answer. So the goal is to just pick a side. Then at the end, if there's one or two you're really passionate about, you're like, there's a lot of nuance. I want to add some context to why I chose the side I did. We'll let you do that. Because I recognize on many of these, you could say it depends. So I'm kind of having a little fun here and just trying to put you on the spot. So you ready?
So are we going for just yes or no's?
You're just picking a side, and then at the end, you can elaborate on one or two.
Okay.
Circular or no circular references?
No circular references.
VBA or no VBA?
I can't do it, so no.
Horizontal or vertical model?
Horizontal.
Dynamic arrays, yes or no?
I'm not good with them, but yeah, I mean, I should be.
External workbook links?
I would never do that.
Yeah, that's a pretty common one. Named ranges in your model?
Yeah. If you feel like it.
When you build models, do you follow a formal standards board like FAST or SMART or some of those that are out there?
No, I don't, but I would if I knew of one.
Okay, makes sense. Do you think Excel will ever die?
Ever? Yes.
In your lifetime?
Yes.
All right. I had to put you on the spot there, put you on the record.
Yeah.
Will AI build the models for us in the future?
100%, yes.
Okay. Should you use sheet cell protection in your models?
Yeah.
All righty. And do you believe financial models are the number one corporate decision-making tool?
Without a doubt.
Somebody told me, no, it's politics. And I was like, that's hard to argue with.
Okay, its financial model is the second most important.
Yeah, exactly. I was like, I can't really argue with that one. I've seen too much of that. So it really made me laugh. I was like, that's a good answer.
Yeah.
All right. So lookup function of choice. And I realize there's more than 4, but I'm not going to list all the different ways a lookup can be done in Excel. So I'm going to list some of the most popular, and you can tell me which one you like. Choose VLOOKUP, index match, or XMatch, XLOOKUP.
Index match.
All right, that's what I figured. You've been modeling for a while. That's usually the favorite if anyone's been doing it for a while.
Is there a different one for newer people?
XLOOKUP with 365 is very common. You could also do nested XLOOKUP, so two-way, similar to index. match.
See, I could probably take one of your courses.
Yeah, you could take my Excel one. We could talk after. It's not
Yeah.
very expensive. I have dynamic arrays, Power Query, and tables in there.
Dynamic arrays would be a cool one. I would love to learn more about that.
Yeah, so we could talk after we're done here. All righty, let's see. Which one would you like to elaborate on? There were one or two of those you hesitated for a minute.
I think the will Excel ever die question, ever, maybe, probably, like in the next like 40 years, like probably not. I think like the use case for Excel will diminish. It's hard for me to imagine a world where AI doesn't basically just do all this stuff pretty automatically for you. And of course, like I basically just bet my career on that fact or that idea. I just don't think that the operations that are performed in Excel are generally more complicated than what can be done in a web app. And once the sort of natural language catches up to a point where you're just going to talk to it, you're just going to talk to the internet and it's just going to build the models for you, kind of a thing. That's the direction that we're going with Iris. So I think it's going to take decades to actually obliterate Excel. That's why I don't even necessarily understand some of these like more enterprise tooling in terms of their target market. Like I would never want to try to unseat Excel out of a real big company. That seems like a crazy task to me. Not that there aren't plenty of tools that have done it, but it seems really, really hard. And Excel is the most bulletproof piece of software ever, so it's not going to die anytime soon.
Yeah, I would not bet my business on having to unseat Excel. It's one thing to say, hey, for this use case, use my tool. It's better for this use case, but continue to use a spreadsheet for other stuff, for edge cases.
And that's what ends up happening with Iris is like Iris is a data warehouse more than anything.
Sure.
And so people will generally export data into Excel if they want to manipulate it in a way that they haven't found, doable.
Yeah, I mean, the three most common buttons in all software: OK, cancel, export to Excel.
I didn't know.
It might be export to Excel first. I'm not sure about that. But,
yeah, it probably is. Yeah, it probably is.
Right. All righty. So I appreciate that. So we're going to wrap up here. Just have two more questions for you, just another minute or so. First one is if you could offer one piece of advice to our audience that would make them a better financial modeler, what would that advice be?
This is going to sound drastic, but like start a business, or at least like start like a fake business that you have to think about. Because once you have to like think about actual actions within a business, it makes it a little bit more intuitive to actually build the model, right? So if you're building a model and you're saying it can be an imaginary business. Let's say, we're going to launch a product in Q3. And so therefore I need to adjust my marketing spend in Q3. Oh crap. When I adjust my marketing spend in Q3, my CAC goes up or whatever the output is. And so it forces you to think about, the actual roadmap of the business. And so I think if you can put yourself into an operator's shoes, whereas before when I was doing it on Wall Street, it was way harder for me to sort of like conceptualize the actual drivers of these models. And so I think when I started my first business and I was sort of building out models, not for exactly like the most practical purposes, but it does really make you kind of think through it. And so if you can try to put your shoes into, sort of like the CEO role, and because like you said, like, financial model is the roadmap for the business, or maybe I said that, but whatever. In terms of like understanding, different levers of the business. When are we going to make hires? When are we launching products? Like, how do we think seasonality is going to look? It's all these qualitative aspects that I think really help inform the quantitative deliverable that is the model.
I would agree with that. And I've had others say, like, one person's like, start by modeling your life, build a 3-statement with a budget. So it's something you can relate to, similar like a dummy business. Understand how cash flow and the things interact in a real world scenario so you can start relating that to different businesses and how they operate. Makes a lot of sense.
I think modeling your personal finances would be a great, because you are a business, right? You have income and expenses.
You have a balance sheet, right? You have equity, you have debt, you have cash flow. Are you using a credit card? Are you putting things on credit? Whatever.
Yeah, exactly. That's a great example. I like that.
Yeah, I really like that one too when he shared it. I'm like, that makes a good point. He's like, that's how I learned to model. As I started to build my own budget, my own life, and modeled it all and practice new things in Excel to get better. Good way to do it. All right. So if our audience wants to learn more about you, what's the best way for them to do that, to maybe get in touch with you?
I am most active on Twitter at Drew Fallon 12. I'm tweeting, mostly about those things that we talked about today. So definitely, if you find it relevant, then give me a follow. I also started doing more on LinkedIn. I think, Paul, we talked about this last time a little bit. I'm trying to get more into the LinkedIn game. So Drew Fallon there, I guess is just your name. And yeah, those are my socials. And then irisfinance.co is our website for anybody who wants to check us out there too.
All right, great. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, Drew. You're the first guest we've had to really dive deep into e-commerce. So I appreciate you taking time and sharing your knowledge there with our audience. Thanks for joining.
Of course. Thank you for having me.
Financial Modeler's Corner was brought to you by the Financial Modeling Institute. This year, I completed the Advanced Financial Modeler certification, and it made me a better financial modeler. What are you waiting for? Visit FMI at www.fminstitute.com/podcast and use code podcast to save 15% when you enroll in one of the accreditations today.